Georgia just beat Georgia Tech 31-23. Instant reaction filling in for Matt DeBerry here. I am Ryan Curley from Dawg Post. It was not pretty for the Dogs today. Really had to run all over Georgia Tech to win. Hey look, cold night. I've got my electric hand warmer. All right, I'm in the box. It was a cold night, and we saw in the last couple of years these cold nights, Georgia likes to pound the rock and try to get out of there. And guess what? Look, there are bigger things ahead for this Georgia Bulldogs team a week from now than today. And I'm not insinuating that Georgia was looking too far ahead, and that's why it didn't play lights out tonight. But no, this wasn't Georgia's best game of the year. Georgia just went through a gauntlet over the last month. When you talk about after the bye week, Florida, Tennessee, Missouri, Ole Miss, not in that order. That was a gauntlet of really tough teams. This is, the best Tech team that Georgia's seen in the last few years. And, Georgia kind of bullies its way to a 31-23 win. Could have been secured earlier on. It could have been secured earlier than it did. Carson Beck threw an interception there in the fourth quarter when Georgia was up 31-16. A goal line interception. It kind of bounces off of Marcus Jackson. Not blaming that on Carson Beck, but that was Georgia's chance to just kind of secure the game and go up by, it would have been 38-16. We're talking about 38-16 towards the end of the fourth quarter instead of 31-23. After that drive, Haynes King and the Georgia Tech offense goes down and scores on Georgia. That was the bad for Georgia in this game. You know what the bad was? It was the fact that Georgia Tech ran for over 200 yards on them, just like Auburn did. And in this game, not too dissimilar in when the clock is ticking like that and a team is running successfully. The game can kind of just go away all of a sudden. For Georgia, had control, right? Had control. Let's go back to the beginning of the game. Georgia Tech doesn't score on the opening drive, right? The last 5 teams have scored on the opening drive of Georgia, and I think it's happened around 7-8 times this season, if I'm counting correctly. It's happened more than 5 times, but that's what goes on for Georgia. And then they get the ball back after they force the Jackets to punt. Dejan Edwards fumbles on the first play of scrimmage for Georgia on offense. So it was a tough start for the Dogs. Yet again, it wasn't this really pretty start the way it was against Ole Miss. And, turn the ball over early is part of why close games happen. Turn the ball over early. And I've got the stats pulled up in this game. Carson Beck, this was not a huge game for Carson Beck, right? 175 yards and a touchdown and an interception on 13 for 20. Those were his numbers. And this was not a game where Georgia went into it and was trying to pass the ball all over Georgia Tech. It was obvious. Look, Georgia ran 20 times. Georgia passed 20 times. Georgia ran 39 times behind Kendall Milton's 156 on 18 carries, 2 touchdowns. Dejan Edwards, 13 carries, 55 yards, and a touchdown. Dylan Bell had a carry. He had 29 yards. Real quick on Dylan Bell. It's obvious that Georgia does good things when Dylan Bell has the ball in his hands. He is a clear weapon for this Georgia offense, whether it be through the air, whether it be through the ground, or whether it be on the ground. And obviously, they trust the guy to make wide open passes as well, as you saw in the Tennessee game last week. But Kendall Milton, that's the story here. He really pounded it. You looked up and Kendall Milton was rushing for a first down. He was running for a first down. He hit the hole and he was gone a few times. He got to the second and third level really fast. So Edwards, not the best day for him. And honestly, let's be real, Dejan Edwards is a very, very good running back. Kendall Milton has kind of been their clear best running back since he's been healthy, and he's, look, the guy has dealt with hamstring injuries, ankle injuries, knee injuries all of his career, and this year he has the hamstring during fall camp. He's got the MCL during the season. Kendall Milton hasn't been able to stay healthy, and over this last month he's done a much better job of doing that. And what has that equated to? Him running for 100 yards on these teams, him running for 2 touchdowns on these teams. He was very, very important in an offensive game where Ladd McConkey wasn't out there, Brock Bowers wasn't out there. Georgia is dealing with injuries. Tate Ratledge wasn't out there. Ra Thomas wasn't out there. Georgia has been dealing with injuries. It's dealing with injuries on this offense still. Bowers was dressed out. Ratledge was dressed out. Ladd McConkey was not dressed out in this game. We know he didn't even practice 2 weeks ago. At this point, not this past week, but we know he didn't even participate in practice 2 weeks ago. Georgia tonight, on defense, they allowed Georgia Tech to fly down the field a few times. And it was bend but don't break. But Georgia, look, let's be honest, Georgia's defense did break a little bit. A couple of red zone touchdowns there for the Yellow Jackets. Haynes King was effective. Quarterbacks have been effective running. Ooh, my bad. Quarterbacks have been effective running on Georgia. And when you look ahead to next week with Jalen Milroe, you wonder if that's going to be an issue. Jalen Milroe, a guy who can run for 200 yards, can run for 3 touchdowns. And that's going to be an interesting thing that Georgia will have to deal with. Obviously dealt with it a little bit tonight with Haynes King. But here's the thing about this Georgia defense. Might be able to run on it a little bit, but Georgia's defense has not allowed itself to get torched through the air this season, and Haynes King wasn't going to be the first one to do that. 11 for 20 for 158 yards. He made a couple nice throws, but if you're one-dimensional on offense and you can't be super successful, if you're not super successful through the air either, and it's just one or the other, you're probably not beating this Georgia team. And Georgia, to me, it didn't really feel like the game was never really in doubt for Georgia, even though it took a touchdown in the second quarter. The first lead for Georgia was with 12:40 left in the second quarter. So that was the first time Georgia actually took the lead, but it never felt like the game was really in doubt. It felt like Georgia was always kind of in control during this thing, but chances to put the game to bed and didn't. And it's reminiscent. This game kind of reminds me of a mixture of some of the other games this year. Kind of reminds me of the Vanderbilt game in a way, where it was just kind of sloppy and Georgia was just like, the details just weren't there for Georgia, and that's why that game ended up being 37 to 20-ish, right? With Auburn, it was because of the turnovers and Auburn being able to run the ball so much. That's why it was a close game. Well, guess what? That's part of why it was a close game tonight. Part of that, I think, is game plan. Georgia's obviously was not trying to air it out and not trying to just run Tech out of the stadium. It just didn't seem like that was the goal for Georgia tonight. It was to pound the rock and get out of this game in a cold weather game. Look, these cold weather games kind of suck. I'm literally holding on to my hand warmer here as we're doing this thing. But on defense, Georgia, defensive backs did a good job of not getting beat. There was a couple times where the linebackers got beat in coverage, and I thought Georgia Tech didn't take advantage of that. Haynes King, there was one time where he could have thrown a touchdown because a wide receiver had C.J. Allen beat out on the sideline, and he just misses the throw. So there were missed opportunities for Georgia Tech. I'm not one to sit here and talk about reffing too much, officiating too much. I do think there were a lot of missed holding calls on the Georgia Tech offensive line, and look, at the end of the day, I do think Georgia Tech's offensive line played really well against Georgia's defensive line. I mean, they moved the needle and created holes. And on those stretch run plays, on those option run plays, Georgia Tech was successful at times in getting to the outside and getting a first down, getting 5, 6, 7 yards. It felt like Georgia Tech did that a lot more than most of these other teams did. And, it's not often that a team rushes for 200 yards on Georgia. Like I said, I think the only other time that that's happened this year was Auburn. And in turn, with those turnovers, it equates to a close game. So let's talk about Carson Beck a little bit again. Made a couple mistakes, right? We'll talk about the battle with Carson Beck. He makes a couple of errant throws a game, and that's kind of what Kirby Smart said a couple weeks ago. He makes a couple of errant throws a game. You get rid of that, Georgia's really not making many mistakes on offense outside of fumbling the ball. And there was a couple balls where I thought it was going to be intercepted, and maybe Carson Beck shouldn't have thrown that ball, completed some of those, didn't complete some of those, and then you see an example where he does get an interception in a goal line situation when Georgia, I thought they probably should have just ran the ball there and even just gotten a field goal. That would have made it, at that point, a 3-score game instead of a 2-score game, and Tech was able to take that 2-score game and take it to a 1-score game. So look, at the end of the day, this was not pretty for Georgia. Bigger fish to fry heading into next week against Alabama for the SEC Championship. Big note, though, Georgia 12-0 in the regular season for the third straight year, ending in the year with a win over Tech to go 12-0 for the third straight year. Kind of a special things for the Dawgs. Maybe there are more special things ahead. Thanks for sticking with me for this instant reaction video, and we'll see you in Riding Home.